I was 37 years old when I finally asked my mother the question I'd been carrying my entire life. Are you proud of me? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds, I got my answer. Not from what she said, because she eventually stammered something about how I'd done well for myself, but from the hesitation, the discomfort, the way her eyes couldn't quite meet mine. That's when I understood that what my mother never said had shaped my entire life, more than anything she ever spoke aloud. To understand how I became a woman who spent 4 decades trying to earn approval that was never coming, you need to know about my mother and the language she spoke fluently. The language of unspoken disappointment. My mother, Patricia, wasn't a cruel woman. She never screamed at me, never told me I was worthless, never used the kind of overtly damaging words that leave obvious scars. If you'd asked anyone who knew her, they would have said she was a good mother, devoted, responsible, present. She drove me to school activities, made sure I had clean clothes and hot meals, attended parent-teacher conferences. By all external measures, she did everything right. But there was something missing. Something I couldn't name as a child but felt in every interaction, her genuine delight in who I was. I was an observant child, sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in our home. I learned early to read my mother's moods not through what she said, but through what she didn't say. The slight tightening of her mouth when I showed her a drawing I was proud of. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes when I told her about making the school play. The polite but distant, "That's nice, dear," when I shared something I was excited about. My older brother, Michael, seemed to get a different version of our mother. When he brought home his report card, she'd beam and put it on the refrigerator. When he scored a goal in soccer, she'd call our grandmother to brag. When he expressed interest in becoming an engineer like our father, she'd talk about it for weeks with such pride in her voice that I'd feel a physical ache in my chest. With me, everything was muted. My A's were expected, so they earned a nod. My artistic talents were nice hobbies, but not something to be taken seriously. My dreams of becoming a writer were met with concerned looks and gentle suggestions that I think practically about my future. I remember being 11 years old, winning a local writing contest for a short story I'd poured my heart into. I was so excited to tell my mother. I ran home from school, clutching the certificate, bursting through the door with the biggest smile on my face. Mom, I won, my story won first place." She was folding laundry in the living room. She looked up, and I saw it, that flash of something across her face. Not quite disappointment, not quite disinterest, but something that made my excitement deflate like a punctured balloon. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, in the same tone she'd used to acknowledge that I'd remembered to take out the trash. Then she turned back to folding towels. "Make sure you do your homework before dinner." That was it. No questions about the story, no asking to read it, no celebration. Michael walked in 10 minutes later and mentioned he might try out for the basketball team, and suddenly she had time to stop folding and have an entire animated conversation about it. I learned something in that moment, something I wouldn't have words for until decades later. My achievements weren't worth celebrating unless they aligned with what my mother valued. And what she valued, I was beginning to understand, wasn't who I was. As I grew older, I started to decode the pattern. My mother had specific ideas about what made a daughter valuable, what made a life worthwhile, what choices were respectable. These ideas were never explicitly stated. She was too polite, too careful with her words for that. But they were communicated constantly through her responses, and more powerfully, through her lack of response. When I chose to study English literature in college instead of something practical, like business or education, she didn't argue with me. She simply went quiet. She didn't ask about my classes, didn't want to hear about the books I was reading, didn't show any interest in the literary analysis I was passionate about. But when my friend Amanda from church got accepted to nursing school, my mother talked about it for weeks. "Now that's a stable career," she'd say, not looking at me but making sure I could hear. "That's something with a real future." The message was clear. My choices were not the right ones. When I got my first job after college at a small literary magazine, a position I was thrilled about despite the low pay, my mother's response was a tight smile and a comment about how everyone has to start somewhere. Meanwhile, Michael got a corporate position at a tech company, and my mother treated it like he'd won the Nobel Prize. She'd bring it up at family gatherings, tell her friends, beam with pride that wouldn't fit on her face. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was doing what I loved, that her approval wasn't necessary. But every time I visited home and saw that flatness in her eyes when I talked about my work, every time she changed the subject when I mentioned a professional achievement, every time she failed to ask me a single question about my life while peppering Michael with interested inquiries about his, I felt that old familiar ache. I wasn't enough. I would never be enough because I wasn't the daughter she'd wanted. By my late 20s, I'd internalized my mother's silent disappointment so thoroughly that it had become the lens through which I viewed my entire life. Every decision I made was filtered through an internal voice that sounded suspiciously like her. Is this respectable enough? Is this what a successful person does? What will people think? I was 28 when I got engaged to a man named David. He was kind, creative, worked as a high school English teacher, and we shared a genuine connection. I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. When I told my mother, I waited for something, excitement, joy, the kind of maternal enthusiasm I'd seen her display when Michael announced he was dating someone. What I got was a measured, "That's lovely, dear," followed by a strategic pause. Then, "What does David's father do?" Not "Tell me about him," not "I'm so happy for you," not "When do I get to meet him properly?" Just a question about his family's social standing disguised as polite interest. "He's a contractor," I said. "Self-employed, does really well." Another pause. "And his mother?" "She's a nurse." "I see." Two words that carried volumes. I wasn't hearing approval. I was hearing assessment, measurement, and finding us just slightly wanting. The wedding planning was an exercise in reading between the lines. My mother never said she disapproved of my choices. She just failed to be enthusiastic about anything. The venue was fine. The dress was nice. The flowers were pretty. Every response was neutral enough to be technically positive while communicating absolute lack of excitement. When Michael got engaged 2 years later to Amanda, a corporate lawyer, my mother transformed into a different person. Suddenly she had opinions about everything, excited opinions, passionate preferences, genuine investment. She helped Amanda pick out her dress, threw her a shower, cried at the wedding in a way that suggested pure joy. At my wedding, she'd smiled politely in photos and made pleasant small talk with guests. At Michael's, she glowed. I watched her at his reception, holding court with relatives, talking about what a beautiful couple they made, how proud she was, how perfect everything was. And I realized, this is what maternal pride looks like. I'd never seen it directed at me, but here it was, radiant and unmistakable, and it wasn't mine. David noticed. One night shortly after Michael's wedding, lying in bed in our small apartment, he said quietly, "Your mother doesn't approve of us, does she?" I wanted to deny it, but I was tired of pretending. She doesn't disapprove exactly, she just doesn't think I made the right choices. You mean choosing me? Choosing anything. My career, my life, you, where we live, how we live. Nothing I do quite measures up to whatever ideal she has in her head. Have you ever asked her directly what she wants from you? She'd never tell me. That's not how she works. She doesn't say what she thinks. She just lets you know through silence and subtle reactions that you've disappointed her. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one too small to make a fuss about, but collectively they bleed you dry. David held me that night while I cried, finally releasing years of accumulated hurt from trying and failing to be whatever my mother needed me to be. My career became another arena for this silent disappointment. I worked my way up at the literary magazine, eventually becoming an editor. I was good at my job. I found talented writers, helped shape important stories, contributed to literary culture in ways that mattered to me. I was proud of my work. My mother never asked about it, never once. When I'd visit home, she'd ask surface-level questions. "How's work?" with the tone of someone making obligatory conversation. When I'd try to share something I was excited about, her eyes would glaze over. She'd nod politely and then pivot to asking if I'd heard that Michael just got another promotion. But she'd talk endlessly about her friend Carol's daughter who worked in pharmaceutical sales, about our neighbor's daughter who married a doctor, about some distant cousin who got a real job at a bank. The subtext was always clear. These were the paths worth taking. Mine was not. I started to notice how she introduced me to people. With Michael, it was always, "This is my son, Michael. He's a senior director at Tech Innovations." With pride, with specificity, with a voice that suggested she was showing off something valuable. With me, it was, "This is my daughter, Sophia. She works in publishing," said with a verbal ellipsis, a slight downturn in energy, a tone that suggested this was the best spin she could put on something mildly embarrassing. I'd feel myself shrink every time, feel that old familiar shame creep in, feel like I needed to apologize for my existence. The breaking point came when I was 34 years old. David and I had been trying to have a baby for 2 years with no success. It was emotionally devastating. The monthly cycle of hope and disappointment, the medical interventions, the questions about what might be wrong with my body, the grief of a future I'd imagined that seemed to be slipping away. I needed my mother. Despite everything, despite the years of feeling unseen and unvalued, I needed her maternal comfort during this painful time. I went to visit her one afternoon, planning to open up about what David and I were going through. We sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd shared countless moments of my life with her, and I started to tell her. "Mom, David and I have been dealing with something difficult. We've been trying to have a baby and it's not happening. We're seeing specialists and it's really hard." I watched her face, still hopping after all these years, to see compassion, understanding, the kind of maternal empathy I'd witnessed her give to others. What I saw instead was a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Then she said, "Well, you did wait until you were older to start trying. Women's fertility declines significantly after 30. I felt like I'd been slapped. "No, I'm sorry you're going through this. No, how can I support you?" No maternal comfort at all. Just criticism, delivered in that neutral tone she'd perfected, that made it sound like she was simply stating facts while actually communicating judgment. "I got married at 28, Mom. That's not exactly late. If you'd chosen a more stable career path, maybe you and David would have felt more financially secure to start a family sooner." Everything in me went cold. Even this, even my grief, even my pain. She'd found a way to make it about my failures, my wrong choices, my inadequacy. "I shared something vulnerable with you," I said slowly, "and your response is to tell me it's my fault." "I'm not saying it's your fault, Sophia. I'm simply pointing out that choices have consequences." "Right, my choices, my wrong choices, because everything I've ever done has been wrong in your eyes." She looked genuinely surprised. "I don't know what you mean. I've always supported you." And that's when something broke open in me. All the years of silent disappointment, all the withheld approval, all the subtle messages that I wasn't enough, it all came flooding up. "You've never supported me. You've tolerated me. There's a difference. You've never celebrated my achievements, never shown genuine interest in my work, never treated my life choices as valid. You've spent my entire existence communicating through silence and subtle reactions that I'm a disappointment to you." "That's not true. I love you." "You might love me, but you don't like me. You don't like who I am, what I've chosen, how I live. And you've never said it directly, but I've felt it my entire life." My mother's face went pale. "You're being overly sensitive. I've never said anything like that." "Exactly, you've never said anything. That's the problem. You don't say you're proud of me. You don't say you admire my work. You don't say I made a good choice marrying David. You don't say anything positive. But your silence speaks volumes. Your lack of enthusiasm, your failure to ask questions, your complete disinterest in my life, that's all communication, Mom. And I've heard it loud and clear for 34 years. She stood up, turned away from me. "I think you're projecting your own insecurities onto me. I've never done anything but try to guide you toward a good life. A good life according to your definition, not mine. And when I chose differently, you punished me with silence and distance. I think you should leave. You're clearly very emotional right now and saying things you don't mean. I left, and as I drove home, shaking with adrenaline and old pain finally released, I realized something. I'd finally said what I'd needed to say my entire life. And her response had confirmed everything I'd always known. She couldn't hear it. She couldn't acknowledge it. She would never give me what I needed. David held me that night while I sobbed. Not just for the infertility we were facing, but for the mother-daughter relationship I'd wanted my whole life and was finally accepting I'd never have. In the months following that confrontation, I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Rachel Martinez. I'd gone initially to process the infertility struggles, but the sessions quickly became about something deeper: my relationship with my mother and how it had shaped every aspect of my life. "Tell me about your internal voice," Dr. Martinez said during one of our early sessions. "When you're making a decision or evaluating yourself, whose voice do you hear?" I thought about it. Mine, I guess. "Are you sure? Or is it your mother's voice that you've internalized so completely you think it's yours?" The question hit me like a freight train. I started paying attention to my thoughts, really listening to that critical internal voice I'd carried my whole life. And Dr. Martinez was right. It wasn't mine. It was my mother's. When I looked at my work, I heard her. "Is this respectable? Is this what successful people do?" When I looked at my life choices, I heard her. "This isn't quite right. This isn't enough." When I looked at myself, I heard her. "You could be better. You should be different." I'd spent 4 decades with my mother's voice in my head, so familiar I'd mistaken it for my own thoughts. I'd made decisions based on trying to quiet that voice, trying to finally earn approval that would silence it. But it never worked because the voice was internal now. I'd taken her in completely. Dr. Martinez introduced me to a concept that changed everything: intergenerational trauma and the mother wound. "Many women," she explained, "grow up with mothers who had their own unfulfilled dreams, their own disappointments, their own wounds they never processed. And they unconsciously project all of that onto their daughters. Your mother may have wanted a different life for herself, a more prestigious career, a higher social status, a different kind of validation. When she didn't get it, she tried to live vicariously through her children. Michael seemed to fulfill that vision. You didn't. So she communicated her disappointment, not because you actually failed, but because you weren't fulfilling her unlived dreams. This reframed everything. My mother's disappointment in me wasn't about me at all. It was about her, about what she'd wanted for herself and didn't have, about the respectable, impressive life she'd yearned for, about her need for external validation through her children's achievements. I started asking questions about my mother's life that I'd never thought to ask before. I called my aunt, my mother's sister, and asked about my mother's youth, her dreams, her early adulthood. What I learned was illuminating. My mother had been very intelligent, had wanted to go to college for business or law, had dreamed of a professional career. But she'd grown up in the 50s and 60s, in a family that believed women should marry and support their husbands, not have careers of their own. She'd married my father at 21, had Michael at 22, me at 24. She'd set aside her own ambitions to be a wife and mother. She always seemed a little sad, my aunt told me. Like she was living half a life. She loved you kids, but I think she resented giving up what she could have been. Suddenly, so much made sense. My mother's overinvestment in Michael's corporate success, living vicariously through him. Her disinterest in my creative career. It was too far from the prestigious professional path she'd wanted for herself. Her emphasis on social status and respectability, the things she'd valued but never achieved. I wasn't her disappointment because I'd failed. I was her disappointment because I'd chosen freedom and passion over prestige and status, and that choice reminded her of what she'd given up. She'd been silently communicating her own regrets, her own unfulfilled yearnings, her own resentments, and I'd internalized them as judgments about my worth. Understanding the pattern didn't make it hurt less, but it did help me start the work of separation, learning to distinguish between my mother's voice and my own, between her disappointments and my actual reality. Dr. Martinez gave me an exercise. Whenever I noticed that critical internal voice, I was to pause and ask, is this true? Or is this my mother's fear-disappointment projection? I started doing this constantly. The voice would say, your career isn't impressive enough. I'd stop and ask, is that true? By whose standards? My work is meaningful to me. I'm making a living doing something I love. That is impressive by any reasonable measure. This is my mother's value system, not mine. The voice would say, you made wrong choices. I'd challenge it, wrong according to whom? My choices led me to a life I'm genuinely happy with, a marriage I value, work I'm passionate about, authenticity I've fought for. How is that wrong? The voice would say, you'll never be enough. And I'd counter, I'm enough for me, and that's what actually matters. It was exhausting at first, this constant vigilance, this work of disentangling myself from my mother's internalized voice. But gradually, I started to hear my own voice emerge, quieter at first, less certain, but authentically mine. My own voice said, I like who I've become. My own voice said, I'm proud of my choices, even the unconventional ones. My own voice said, I don't need my mother's approval to know my worth. I also had to grieve. Grieve for the mother I'd needed and never had. Grieve for the unconditional acceptance that wasn't available to me. Grieve for the relationship I'd spent decades trying to force into existence when it was never going to be what I needed. This grief was complicated because my mother was still alive, still in my life. I wasn't grieving a death. I was grieving the reality of a relationship that existed versus the fantasy of what I'd hoped it could be. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I could love my mother while also protecting myself from her inability to see me. That I could have some relationship with her while accepting its limitations. That I could stop trying to earn something she wasn't capable of giving. Around this time, David and I made the decision to stop pursuing fertility treatments. It was painful, but we'd reached a point where the emotional and physical toll was too much. We decided that if parenthood was meant for us, it would come through adoption, and if it wasn't, we'd build a different kind of life together. When I told my mother, keeping my expectations low this time, her response was telling. Well, adoption is expensive, and there are no guarantees you'll get a healthy child. Not support, not empathy, just more subtle communication that my choices were questionable. But this time, I didn't absorb it. I didn't internalize it. I recognized it for what it was, her speaking from her own fears and limitations, not commenting on my actual reality. We'll figure it out, Mom, I said calmly, and I changed the subject. I started setting boundaries with her, small ones at first. When she'd make a subtle critical comment, I'd say, I'm not going to discuss this with you. When she'd compare me unfavorably to Michael or someone else, I'd say, that's not helpful, Mom, and redirect. She didn't like it. She'd get quiet, withdrawn, hurt. The old me would have immediately backtracked, apologized, soothed her feelings. The new me, the one learning to hear my own voice, held firm. Because I realized her discomfort with my boundaries wasn't my problem to fix. Her inability to see me wasn't my failure. Her disappointment in my choices wasn't a reflection of my worth. I was 37 years old when I decided I needed to have one final, honest conversation with my mother. Not because I expected it to change her or fix our relationship, but because I needed to say certain things out loud for my own closure and healing. I invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant. She seemed pleased. We hadn't spent much one-on-one time since our fight years earlier, and our relationship had settled into polite but distant. After we'd ordered, I took a breath and said, Mom, I need to talk to you about something important, and I need you to really listen, not defend or explain. Can you do that? She looked wary but nodded. I've spent my entire life trying to earn your approval, trying to be the daughter you wanted, trying to make choices you'd be proud of. And I finally realized, after years of therapy, that I was trying to earn something you're not capable of giving. Not because you're cruel, but because of your own wounds and unfulfilled dreams. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. Please, let me finish. I understand now that your disappointment in my choices has nothing to do with my actual worth or success. It has to do with your own regrets about what you gave up, your own yearning for prestige and status that you projected onto me. You wanted me to achieve the things you couldn't, and when I chose differently, it felt like rejection to you. But it wasn't about you. It was about me building a life that felt authentic to who I am. I could see her getting defensive, her posture stiffening. I'm not telling you this to hurt you or blame you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand how your silence has affected me. You never had to say I was a disappointment. I felt it in every interaction. In what you didn't ask about my life. In how you didn't celebrate my achievements. In the way you lit up for Michael but went flat for me. Children absorb these things, Mom, and I absorbed the message that I wasn't enough. She finally spoke, her voice tight. I've always loved you. I believe you, but love and approval are different things. You loved me, but you never approved of me, and I needed both. I don't know what you want from me, Sophia. I did my best. I know you did, and I'm not here to ask you to change or apologize. I'm here to tell you that I'm done trying to be someone you can approve of. I'm done contorting myself to fit your vision of what my life should be. I'm done carrying your disappointment as if it's a reflection of my failure. So you're rejecting me. No, I'm accepting reality. The reality is that you and I see the world differently. We value different things, and that's okay. But I can't keep sacrificing my peace trying to bridge that gap. Tears were running down her face now. I don't understand how you can say these things to me after everything I've done for you. And there it was, the martyrdom, the deflection, the inability to hear what I was actually saying. Mom, I appreciate everything you provided for me growing up. The stability, the practical care, the sacrifice. But what I needed beyond the practical, the emotional validation, the genuine interest, the unconditional acceptance, that wasn't there. And I can acknowledge both truths. You gave me what you were capable of giving. It just wasn't everything I needed. We sat in painful silence. Finally, she said, "What do you want from me now?" Nothing. I'm not asking you to change. I just needed to say this out loud. I needed you to hear, even if you can't accept it, that your silent disapproval shaped my entire life. And now I'm working to unshape it. The lunch ended awkwardly. She was hurt and defensive. I was relieved and sad. Nothing was resolved because resolution was never the point. The point was saying what I needed to say. That's when I asked her the question from the hook, the one that had haunted me my whole life. Are you proud of me? And her hesitation, her discomfort, her inability to give me a simple yes. It was the final answer I needed. Not the answer I wanted, but the truth I could finally accept. The year I turned 40 was transformative. David and I had been matched with a birth mother who chose us to adopt her baby, a daughter we named Emma. Becoming a mother myself brought everything full circle in unexpected ways. Holding Emma for the first time, I felt something I'd never experienced, an uncomplicated desire for this small human to feel loved and accepted exactly as she was. I didn't look at her and project my own unfulfilled dreams. I didn't imagine who she should become. I just saw her, perfect and complete in herself. And I made a promise to her and to myself. I would break the pattern. The generational cycle of unspoken disappointment, of love tangled with conditional approval, of silent criticism that shapes a child's sense of worth, it ended with me. My mother's reaction to Emma's adoption was predictably lukewarm. "Adoption is wonderful," she said in that neutral tone I knew so well. Then, after a pause, "though you never know what you're going to get genetically." 5 years earlier, that comment would have devastated me. It would have confirmed all my fears that I could never make the right choice in her eyes. But now, holding my daughter, I just felt sad for my mother. Sad that her fears and limitations prevented her from experiencing the full joy of this moment. "She's perfect," I said simply, and I didn't elaborate or defend or try to convince her. I just held my truth. Motherhood has taught me what I needed to learn, that unconditional love is possible. That I can delight in another human exactly as they are. That approval doesn't need to be earned, it can just exist. Every time Emma does something, draws a picture, tells me a story, shares a dream, I respond with genuine enthusiasm. Not performed, not obligatory, but real. I ask follow-up questions. I show interest. I celebrate her exactly as she is. Sometimes I see my mother watching these interactions with a look I can't quite read. Maybe she's seeing what she couldn't give me. Maybe she's uncomfortable with the contrast. Maybe she doesn't notice at all. I've learned to stop trying to interpret her reactions. I've also learned that I can have compassion for my mother's limitations while not being destroyed by them. She was shaped by her own mother, by her era, by unfulfilled dreams she never processed. She did the best she could with the tools she had. It just wasn't enough to meet my needs. And that's okay. Because I found what I needed elsewhere, in therapy, in my relationship with David, in chosen family, in friends who see and value me, and now in the relationship I'm building with Emma. My mother and I have settled into a distant but cordial relationship. We see each other on holidays, exchange polite updates on our lives. I no longer seek her approval or try to change her. She is who she is, and I've accepted that. But I also protect Emma from the subtle criticism I absorbed. When my mother makes a neutral but coded comment about Emma's choices, that's an interesting outfit in a tone that suggests it's not appropriate, I intervene. I think she looks beautiful, I say firmly, and I change the subject. I won't let Emma internalize the voice that took me decades to unlearn. I'm 42 now, and I finally have the answer to a question I've been asking my whole life. Am I enough? The answer is yes. Not because my mother finally saw my worth, not because I achieved something that earned her approval, but because I learned to separate her voice from my own and discovered that my value isn't determined by someone else's capacity to see it. What my mother never said, but I felt my entire life, was that I was a disappointment, that my choices were wrong, that I should be different than I was. These messages were communicated through silence and subtle reactions, through what she didn't celebrate and didn't ask about, through the space where maternal pride should have been. But what I've learned is this: the most damaging criticism isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's carried in the things left unsaid, the enthusiasm withheld, the approval forever out of reach. And that kind of wound, the one that leaves no visible scar, can shape us more profoundly than overt cruelty. I've also learned that healing from these wounds requires acknowledging they exist, even when no one else can see them. It requires trusting your perception, even when it's denied or minimized. It requires grieving what you needed and didn't get, even from people who insist they gave you everything. Most importantly, I've learned that you can love someone and still protect yourself from the way they see you. That you can honor your mother while refusing to be diminished by her limitations. That you can grieve the relationship you needed while building a life that doesn't depend on getting it. My mother will probably never understand the impact her silence had on me. She'll likely continue to believe she was a good mother who loved her children, and by her definition, she was. The disconnect isn't about right or wrong. It's about two people speaking different languages, one of words and one of unspoken emotional communication. But I've stopped trying to translate for her. I've stopped trying to make her understand. I've accepted that some people can't see what they can't see, can't hear what they can't hear, can't give what they never learned to give. And I've chosen to build something different with my daughter, a relationship where she knows, beyond any doubt, that she is seen, valued, and enough exactly as she is. Where my enthusiasm for her is genuine, not performed. Where she never has to decode silence to understand how I feel. The generational pattern of unspoken disappointment ends here. Not through confrontation or conversion, but through conscious choice. The choice to do it differently, to love loudly instead of loving silently, to celebrate instead of withhold. I can't change what my mother never said, but I can decide what I will say to Emma, to myself, to anyone who needs to hear it. You are enough. You have always been enough, and your worth has never been determined by someone else's inability to see it. What did your mother never say that you always felt? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments.